those two texts are. In the autobiography, for example, he defends himself against the charge that he's just been crammed with knowledge by his father, who did slightly strange things like teaching him ancient Greek at the age of 3. So there are a range of sort of issues for Mill himself about how he defends himself against charges of simply doing what his father sort of trained him to do. He also had a series of kind of, mental crises, he called them, which provoked real doubt about the kind of the beliefs that he kind of held. He had a very complicated relationship with Harriet Taylor, who he eventually married. His own relationships with his family broke down in many cases. He's not an easy man to like. I mean, he's clearly a very elitist character. He talks, for example, about his essays being a form of mental pemmican, which is a kind of hard biscuit that they use on 19th century ships to keep people alive, for future intelligentsia to chew on. So he doesn't sort of he's not immediately approachable and kind of accessible. So, and why he's making this argument then becomes quite an important question. Another important question is who he's in conversation with. It's clear that he's very influenced by Tocqueville and by a range of other European thinkers, and at the same time resists the idea that he might be a disciple of Comte and the Saint-Simons, resists their view of a kind of controlling centralized technocracy. But he's really interested in lots of their emerging ideas about social psychology and the sociology of individuality. Another question to ask is this essay, should it be read just as a response to a very particular mid-19th century context? So he refers to things like societies for the promotion of morals of the working classes, refers to temperance societies, which are trying to abolish the selling of alcohol, refers to Sabbatarianism, the desire to keep the Sabbaths kind of sacred. And he's throughout the essay dealing with a set of or a lack of quietude about the question of, you know, how to respond to this increasing sort of set of demands by a do-gooder community that thinks it knows best for other people. We also need to ask a further question about how this essay fits with other essays, such as the essay on utilitarianism, but also the system of logic, particularly in book 6, which is an extremely, the final section of book 6 is an extremely important sort of document for thinking about how he thinks, what he thinks about the relationship between principles and utility. And as well as the system of logic, there's also the autobiography. And you know, we can also ask, who's he making the argument for? Who's the intended audience? What was their response? How was it read? How you answer those questions will inevitably influence how you read exactly what he's saying. The trouble with that is that means that so to understand anything, you need to understand everything. And since that's not possible, what I'm going to do is to follow what I think is the main line of argument, to examine some apparent weaknesses in it, and to suggest a slightly different reading of what he's saying in the text. I mean, what he says at the beginning about what the text is doing is pretty clear. In the opening section, he sets out in brief compass an account of the challenges in a way that disposes with a set of concerns. He's fundamentally not concerned with tyrannical government. He thinks that, for the most part, is no longer a concern in most Western societies, largely thanks to the rise of constitutionalism and the admissions of principles of representation and the parliamentary character of most European regimes. I mean, we might, in retrospect, think he was being wildly over-optimistic in many of those respects, but that's another issue. However, a second issue arises if we're no longer concerned with that, because those in those states, they've moved from a distrust of ruling power to seeing the ruling power as an expression of the will of the people. And if you think that the ruling power is an expression of the will of the people, then you don't need to be protected against that will, because it is an expression of your will. It's a kind of Rousseauian kind of picture. For Mill, this perspective leads to the tyranny of the majority, the rule of the most powerful, and tyranny of the majority, but he then segues that claim into a claim about this being the rule of the most powerful people in society. And then he expands it more broadly. He's increasingly worried about the likings of and dislikings of society and the generation of legal, but equally unacceptably moral and sort of opinionated intervention that impose costs on individuals who think differently from the majority of the population. So there are a range of concerns being raised here, and the most basic one seems to be that society imposes its majoritarian beliefs on its members, that it resists distinctive and rival views and experiments in living. So at its heart, this essay is really concerned with tolerating ideas and ways of living that we don't like. And as such, it stands in a long line of toleration literature. Law, custom, social convention, and morality, he believes, has to respect individuals' decisions about how to live their lives and should avoid interfering with those decisions. And on liberty aims to justify and to meet that concern, it aims to justify the principle that the sole end for which mankind are warranted individually or collectively in interfering in the liberty of any of its number is self-protection, later defined in terms of the avoidance of harm. And I'll turn to that shortly. He adds what we might call a historical condition to the principle. It's applicable, he says, only to human beings in the maturity of their faculties. So not to the young, children, and he goes on, not to backward states of society in which the race itself may be considered in its nonage, not barbarian states or any people in a condition anterior to the time when mankind have attained the capacity of being guided to their own improvement by free and equal discussion and conviction and persuasion. There are a whole set of questions raised by that point, and I don't have the time to deal with them all. And I'm happy to kind of respond to questions. I find it the least sort of persuasive, the most troubling in many respects aspect of Mill's kind of work. But I think it's something that you can set aside and still think about the essay, even if you don't kind of accept that. Fundamentally, his claim is that after a suitably defined, but very ill defined from his point of view, point in the development of any society, the members of that society have the ability to make decisions about their own interests. And from that point, they should be left to make those decisions, except where their behavior harms others. So the central task he has is to justify that principle and its component claims, and to show that it's coherent as a guide, and to demonstrate that it has a clear set of cases of application. an additional issue raises because he's absolutely clear that he wants to make the case for that principle, not on the ground of natural right, but on the grounds of the utility of respecting the principle. That's raised a huge kind of academic controversy, since utilitarianism is traditionally thought to be, if not directly opposed to doctrines of right, at least an insecure basis for something like a natural right. And people are then very unsure about what kind of utilitarianism Mill is arguing for here. So Mill's introduction, and I'll explore some of those issues as I go through. His introduction sets the focus on the defense of the freedom of individuals in advanced societies to think, speak, and act as they see fit, so long as their doing so doesn't harm others. And he allows harm to include actions and inactions. So failing to act in certain kinds of ways can count as harming others. He thinks this is an area of considerable scope in individual conduct, and he refers to the following: liberty of conscience in the most comprehensive sense, liberty of thought and feeling, absolute freedom of opinion and sentiment on all subjects, practical, speculative, scientific, moral, or theological, and including the liberty of expressing and publishing opinions, liberty of tastes and pursuits, and of framing a plan of life for ourselves. Liberty of combination and association, so you can organize collectively as well. So what is Mill's utilitarian case for this set of liberties? He doesn't invoke a hedonistic sense of utility. It's not about maximizing pleasure in any simple way. His understanding of utility, as he puts it himself, is utility in the largest sense, grounded in the permanent interests of man as a progressive being. He's not claiming that every self-regarding act will promote utility, since it's absolutely clear that some of us will make a mess of our lives. But we should be free to do that, he thinks. We might think that this is a form of rule utilitarianism, but that's not how Mill defends it. And rule utilitarianism is problematic because it seems unable to account for the fastidiousness about the rule when following it produces harm. So how does he reconcile utility and liberty? As I said, Mill is committed to happiness, but at the same time, in a very expanded kind of sense. He thinks a central component of happiness is individual development and the cultivation of individuality. That's not something that you can impose on people. It's about the cultivation of virtues and talents, and it presumes the agency of the individual. You can't be a virtuous person without being an agent. We can help by providing conditions for the development of individuality, and non-interference is a key condition. It blocks intervention on direct utilitarian grounds, interfering just because I think you'd be happier if you did this rather than that. It blocks that, but it enables in the long run and in the broadest term, people to pursue their best lives by promoting kind of their individuality. So, as Mill says, if a person possesses any tolerable amount of common sense and experience, his own mode of laying out his existence is the best, not because it is the best in itself, but because it is his own mode. The other thing I think it's worth bearing in mind is that Mill is a value pluralist. That is, he thinks there are many different ways in which individuals can rationally choose to live their lives. And he thinks that because he thinks there are many potentially competing objective values, and that we are each best able to judge how we wish to live and which values we wish to pursue. People with basic sense and experience in choosing their own path should be attempting to pursue what they see as best, and they should be left alone to do that. The result is that he's operating with a mix of what looks like a utilitarian logic about benefit, contribution to society, and so on, together with a more ancient Greek conception of the nature of a well-lived life and how to achieve that for individuals. So he then tries to set out a number of arguments for each step of his case, and I'll walk us through those reasonably quickly. With respect to freedom of opinion, he believes that individual flourishing is undercut or distorted if people aren't rationally self-directing. And they cannot be that if they can't explore ideas. We can't simply rule out some ideas as wrong or impermissible. And we can't do that because, firstly, opinions that are compelled to silence might turn out to be true. Secondly, the repressed opinion might be wrong, but it might contain some element of truth. Thirdly, if we're to understand and appreciate the significance of a true opinion, it needs to be regularly examined and defended. And that means true opinions have to be challenged. And finally, if they cease to be contested, though truth will will face the danger of becoming dead dogma, and the ground for their acceptance and understanding becomes lost. So his position becomes one that is strongly against custom and habitual deference to received opinion. For individuals and their societies, we need a lively and engaged sense of the value and the pursuit of truth if we're to be self-directing and achieve a degree of independent-mindedness. He acknowledges that there is an issue about how beliefs may be appropriately contested. So how you express your beliefs does become a kind of a potentially problematic issue. It's interesting that his response is to say, well, since most of those who are most offensive are those who are in the minority, then we can take a more tolerant view of that. And it shouldn't be a matter for legal prohibition. It should be a matter for kind of moral, you can express your disapproval for how people are behaving, but without imposing sanctions on them. But he doesn't really make a case for that. And I think, contemporary theorists like Rawls and Habermas worry more about what it is to have a civil form of engagement with with ideas. In chapter 3, he provides a second layer of arguments concerning what the individual gains from living most fully under their own direction and in accordance with their own principles. He begins by admitting restrictions to the principle. So he says somebody who shouts out that points to a corn dealer in a crowd and says that man is sort of hoarding corn and you're starving, we should lynch him. That's an act of free speech, but it's not one that Mill is prepared to accept. He also says you shouldn't be a nuisance to people. But this is a very good example of how reading 19th century texts, you need to use 19th century dictionaries. So this has the older meaning of being harmful or obnoxious. And obnoxious has the older meaning of causing injury or harm. So what we now regard being a nuisance as just a fact of everyday life. But the 19th century had a much stronger kind of sense of nuisance involving harm to others. Throughout, Mill argues for the presumption that in things that don't concern others, the principle of individuality should assert itself. He sees the free development of individuality as one of the leading essentials of well-being and an essential part of civilization. He cites Humboldt on several occasions throughout the essay, and Humboldt has a very strong kind of line about the importance of individuality. It's interesting that he cites him as an authority. He doesn't really set out the details of the case, and doesn't set out the details of Humboldt's case. So Mill's case for choice and self-direction as central to the character central to the development of character and judgment, as against the rote-like performance of custom, um, is set out in the following way. He refers to it as custom as ape-like imitation. Um, you have to recognize this is not a good argument. It's a piece of rhetoric. No one wants to be ape-like. But he moves very quickly into quite a complex set of territories. One in particular is about the idea of strong and weak impulses and strong and weak consciences. What Mill's doing in this discussion is beginning to work out for himself in many respects his response to some Saint-Simonian thinking about active and passive character. He himself, in the system of logic, makes it clear that he's what we would call a necessarianism. He's a necessarian. He believes that our behavior is largely determined. He includes in that the possibility of a degree of emancipation from our education and from our social upbringing, and achieving a kind of a degree of self-determination within that. But he invents a discipline called ethology, which he sets out at some length in the system of logic, which is basically an early form of social psychology and political sociology, thinking about the way in which this individual's psychological structure interacts with societal and political structures in the shaping of character and in the shaping of behavior. So he sees society and history as profoundly shaping how we develop as individuals, but as not fully determining it. So part of what he's doing is defending the individuality for people, defending individuality for people. What it's doing is trying to create spaces in which individuals can develop and flourish within a system which would otherwise be determinist and simply reproduce them as automatons. He does this because individuality is seen as enriching in the individual's life and therefore also enriching the life of society. And it's enriching for the person because it makes his or her life his or hers. We can think of it as a coming into possession of one's self and being able to act on the basis of reason and judgment, which are inevitably influenced by our upbringing and the society we live in, but where we've emancipated ourselves from tutelage to it. And that's a way of seeing how Mill's autobiography works. It is really an account of his own emancipation from his education. And the same kind of argument underlies on liberty. Enabling this emancipation enriches society basically and in crude terms by ensuring that the best ideas and the best minds can flourish, and when they flourish they become dominant, as against the current system in which the dominant class makes sure that their views are ascendant even if they have no merit. He's not worried about there being stronger specimens of kind of human nature, because if they encroach on others or cause harm to others, then there's a ground for intervention. But where it doesn't, where they don't, then we need to allow it, and that will allow the flourishing and self-development of genius and idiosyncrasy. And that sort of mix of genius and idiosyncrasy is really kind of central to Mill's case. And you can see, given the way in which people treated him as a child, there's some autobiographical elements coming into that. He does think that the despotism of custom is everywhere, and that it's a standing hindrance to human advancement. And he makes some pretty sweeping comments about the East in relation to custom being dominant and ensuring that the societies make no progress. So he's in effect drawing a line between European cultures and other kind of cultures in terms of the development of this relatively kind of unique culture of self-determination and self-direction. So he's made a case for the value of liberty of opinion, and he's trying to defend the value of individuality. Can he show that the harm principle is coherent? His basic claim can be reformulated as, wherever some harm is caused to another, society has jurisdiction in the matter. But he also admits that every action may have some impact on another. But that would empty his principle of all content. He deals with that by restricting his focus to intended effects that are reasonably foreseeable, direct, and harmful. So an act is self-regarding when it doesn't directly or intentionally or foreseeably harm another, even if it has effects on them. But this begins to make the very simple principle look much less simple, since its criteria are being expanded by intentionality, foreseeability, and so on. Moreover, admitting acts of admission can be as harmful as acts of commission adds to the kind of complexity. There's also an issue about how far we are allowed to stick our noses into other people's affairs. At the start of the essay, it looks as if Mill wants to stop people poking into our business where it doesn't concern them. But it seems we can criticize and we can reprove them, we can advise, we can do what we think it is our duty to do, but not so as to impose extraneous costs on somebody for their action. For example, by collectively mobilizing against him. You can't act to punish him, even if you act to avoid him. Mill relies quite a lot on the direct versus indirect consequences of people's actions. So he uses the case of the man about to cross a bridge which is in danger of falling down. He says we can warn him, but at some point he accepts that if the man chooses to do it, he should be allowed to do it. The allowing that kind of discussion doesn't look as though it's something he wants to endorse at the beginning of the book, but by the end of the book, it's pretty clear that he does. Another problem is that he says that acts that are violations of good manners may be rightly prohibited, such as offences against decency. That case needs filling out. He makes no attempt whatsoever to fill out. Joel Feinberg, in his 4-volume book, the one on offense to others, gives a very entertaining set of accounts of how you might fill that out. I mean, one example is you end up engaging in indecent acts in public. The indecent acts don't harm anybody. So why are you allowed to interfere with them? One way of thinking about it is that it's not a harm to interests, it's an invasive privatization of public space. But Mill doesn't make that argument, and it's odd that he thinks that you can just walk away from the issue that he raises without making an argument. What's clear is that he thinks his own society has become more and more concerned to interfere with what it regards as repugnant beliefs and actions. Religious diversity, the use of alcohol or stimulants, doing things on the Sabbath, polygamy, and so on. The way he makes his arguments, especially in the final chapter, though, are worth noting, especially because they are often complex and heavily dependent on claims about utility. and sometimes about equality of impact. So, requiring a medical certificate for dangerous drugs is partly objected to on the grounds of adding complexity and cost, where those costs are not evenly borne. Another example is he turns to what he sees as a habit in Britain of allowing people to act for others with the same freedom that they are able to act for themselves. So fathers being able to determine how their children live, and also how their wives, and husbands, how their wives live. Mill challenges that presumption, seeing the state as rightly having the power to supervise a person's exercise of any power that he has over another. So he challenges husbands' power over their wives. And that comes back in his essay on the subjection of women. He also challenges fathers' powers over their children. For example, making the case for the responsibilities of parenthood, including a duty of parents to give their child an education. And an education fitting the child to perform his part well in life towards others and towards himself. So Mill says the state has a right to require a good education for every child, but his expectation is that in requiring it, that would largely render it unnecessary for the state to provide such an education. In this, as elsewhere, he thinks multiple competing provision is better than imposing a single view and its dogmas. What becomes clear is that Mill has a pretty capacious view of harm. It is what we call an interest affecting principle. If we're both in for the same job, and I get it, your interests have been harmed. But this seems to admit an extraordinarily wide range of cases into the harm and to others category. And it narrows severely what can be left to individuals' judgments. And that seems dramatically to undermine what he thought was a very simple principle, and what he's trying to sell to us as a very simple principle. So in conclusion, I just want to suggest he might be making a slightly different argument. With respect to any harm, there remains a question in each case of how we should respond. We can subject it to legal prohibition, censorship, social opprobrium, or social sanctions, or we can choose to ignore it. But our reaction should be based on the utility of that reaction. The ground for any legitimate intervention is that it causes harm to some people. But the criteria for deciding how to react to that harm should be the utility of the reaction. If the first part of the essay puts most of the emphasis on the ground, that is the harm, the second puts most of the emphasis on the judgments of utility in responding to harms. These enter in, firstly, because he links utility to self-development and attaches great weight to non-interference because it facilitates self-development. B, because in considering when and how to intervene in cases of harm, utility turns out largely to favour the case for non-interference. For example, towards the end of the essay, he turns to questions of government intervention to promote particular goods or values. He's got a clear kind of antipathy to government. He thinks things are better done by individuals than those most closely concerned with an issue. He thinks leaving people to do things promotes their mental education, and he thinks it's a danger it's always dangerous to increase the power of government. He makes clear that the discussion that he has of this isn't directly connected to his central theme. So there's a puzzle about why he's including it. His view is that, he's including it partly because it raises this question of the importance of utility in determining when you should be involved. His view is that utility should be understood in large part in relation to self-development. It's integral to it, and it depends on the active development of individual character. That means you're bolting together utility and self-development in a way that means that there's always going to be a presumption in favor of it. Particularly after this kind of key historical point where people become capable of self-direction. It means that it militates very sharply in favor of individual freedom, even when there has been harm. The harm principle then is very much necessary, but not sufficient for any intervention. And sufficiency, in most cases, will not be forthcoming because of the utility of allowing self-development and self-government. When he is strongly in favor of intervention, as in restricting the power of husbands over wives and parents over children, he advocates intervention, but so as to enable the self-direction on the part of the dependent. Similarly, in discussing prostitution and pimps, gambling and keepers of gambling houses, while he doesn't come to a clear verdict, he clearly wants to avoid intervention on moralistic grounds, but he is alert to the strength of a case, of the case for ensuring that those involved, prostitutes and people who gamble, are not acting under duress or being stimulated to act for the interest and purposes of another, so that their interests are harmed. So the harm principle is there, but the harm that he's principally concerned in protecting people from are harms that prevent and damage their self-development. The boundary between self-regarding and other-regarding is clearly fragile in Mill, as I say. What the presumption in favor of self-development does is to shore it up, and it serves to militate against intervention even when there is some harm. Now, and I've worked on Mill's essay for a long time, and it was only you forcing me to do a lecture. Forcing? It was only you asking me to do a lecture that made me kind of think about this, but it does increasingly, I am increasingly persuaded that the things that I thought were objections before about this, worries about whether you can draw a kind of clear line between self-regarding and another, that's much, much less important than recognizing that what Mill's doing here is turning the kind of argument of utility into a principle for promoting individual self-development. There's a final question we might ask. Is he right? What should we think about what he argues? I have no time to answer that. I do think it's a perfectly good question, and I think some approaches to the studies of texts forget it. It's a perfectly good question once we've made sure we understand his position. I think On Liberty is a difficult text, but I think most of the texts in the canon of political thought are difficult. They repay rereading, and they repay rereading often. In doing so, we end up building a repertoire of responses and interpretations, and by reading them alongside other texts and arguing about the interpretation of others, we get better at it, better at the discipline of political theory, but also better about thinking about how we should organize society. I said at the beginning, we should know in order to know anything, we need to know everything. We never know everything. But thinking, like living, is a work in progress. And I'll stop there.
That's a wonderful one line to stop with, and like I'm going to write it down. Thank you, Professor Mark Philp, for this very, very insightful keynote speech. And it's been, some of us have not got the opportunity to be in political theory classroom, so we get a taste of how it is. And now I request we'll have a short Q&A session, if that's okay. And I request the participants to please raise your hands if you have a question and keep your question very brief. If not, you can drop in your questions in the chat box as well. We have a question. I can read it out. Professor, Mill emphasizes the society, it's from Vaishnavi Nambiar. Mill emphasizes the society should only interfere to prevent harm. How do we interpret harm in modern context? What's your take on this?
So, okay. So Mill defines it as harm to interests, which means you then need a criteria for identifying what's in individuals' interests. I gave the example of two people competing for the same job. This looks like just an everyday occurrence, and yet Mill thinks that it's perfectly plausible to regard it as a harm. There is, as a result of this, a huge literature on exactly what counts as harm. If I can be blunt, I don't think much of it is to the point. What worries Mill most is harm to individual development, interference in relation to individual development. So the reason he thinks that you're harmed if you don't get the job is, it blocks your individual development. The reason he thinks it's permissible to be harmed by not getting the job is that the competitive system for kind of work is a crucial part of providing a context in which all individuals can develop and can develop in competition with others. So part of it, I think, what I'm arguing here is that you don't need to worry too much about what counts as a harm. I'll come back to that in a second. But what Mill really wants to do is to put the presumption in favor of letting people say and do what they want to do. Because it's going to be more self-development promoting to do that than it is to constantly interfere with them. That means that what we end up with is, we can invoke sanctions against individuals when their expression of their self-development ends up blocking other people's development of their self-development, other people's development of themselves. So it becomes a much messier kind of story than the kind of standard way of interpreting Mill. But I think that's really what he thinks. Life is very, very complicated. You have to have some kind of criteria. Where people physically harm others, then clearly that's a way of damaging their kind of their security, their sense of self, etc., etc. I mean, just don't think there's a problem about blocking those kinds of behaviors. But in many other respects, like the job case, the presumption ought to lie in allowing people to pursue their own lives in the best way that they see fit.
Thank you, Professor. We have another question. We have a few
Yeah, I
questions.
saw that.
The next is from Agri Pradeep. My question is, how might Mill's idea of liberty help us understand or critique the recent shifts in US foreign policy under Trump, especially the move towards nationalism and retreat from global cooperation?
So I'm just making sure yeah, I hadn't, right. Uh, so Mill has some quite complex thoughts about nationalism, which I don't like. He thinks that nations have an identity, which uh, so I tend to the more cosmopolitan view. Um, I think he would be absolutely horrified by um, what's going on in the world today. uh, um, and I think he'd be horrified by the mobilization of some of his ideas by various people. Um, uh, I think his idea of liberty should help us think harder about what we're concerned about in relation to the rise of far-right movements, certainly within Europe, but also in America and increasingly through the world. Uh, Seems to me the they're moving against a kind of set of received ideas, which in many respects we haven't thought hard enough about and haven't defended carefully enough over the last sort of 40 or 50 years. Um, uh, and I think he's a good person to have on, on the reading list in thinking about how to do that. The retreat from global cooperation, I think this is a paradox of, uh, as you get more and more global markets, so you end up with less and less global cooperation. Um, uh, I can't see that surviving. But I'm not sure that Mill, and certainly Mill's very sort of his more socialist writings are uh, um, very much out of sympathy with the development of kind of global capitalism.
Yeah, thank you. And we have from Mukund Rath, does Mill unknowingly, knowingly place utility in the scheme of things as a way to weaponize individual liberty?
Yeah. No. I mean, it depends what you mean by weaponizing individual liberty. I think he thinks that, I mean, in many respects, he's a government house utilitarian. That he starts from thinking about how you should run things. That's how his father sort of thought about it. It's how the people he mixes. He's thinking utility, in a sense, I mean, in most political ethics, there's a recognition that being in government means that you end up with having to make decisions that you couldn't be allowed to make as ordinary individuals. And you have to make decisions that you aren't allowed to make as ordinary individuals, and you have to use criteria that you shouldn't use as ordinary individuals. So you can use utility in government. Whether you should be using it as a way of governing your relationships with your family is entirely another kind of question, and Mill would block that. So it is a government house sort of way of thinking about things, to say, as we design the laws, as we design the protections that we want people to have in order to allow them to live most fully and to develop most fully, which things are going to have kind of optimum effects here. So I suppose that's how I would respond to that kind of question, but I'm sure that's
Uh,
an inadequate
I,
response.
we have two questions from Muntaha, which I would like to take together. Hello, sir. I would like to know how does Mill's silence on colonialism and structural inequality and the universality of his argument? Also, can religious freedom truly exist in societies where religious identity is tied to national or political belonging?
Ah, I haven't got that last one. So on colonialism,
Yeah, yeah.
so this is the most unacceptable side of Mill. He runs the Indian office for the East India Company until 1855. Um, he's responsible. Well, he's responsible for the correspondence of the society, but basically he's administering India from afar. Um, how do you read it? Well, I think the thing to do, I mean, it has been addressed by increasingly kind of wide literature, and I think in lots of interesting ways. Does it affect the universality of his argument? I think it raises questions about parts of the argument, like societies need to reach a certain level before the liberty principle kind of operates. Um, I think there are real kind of questions about whether um, if the argument about self-development is good, then it's surely good all the way through. Uh, just, but he's clearly right. I mean, you know, wait, let me rephrase that. He's clearly in line with most of the other people that he's dealing with. What we're dealing here with is very much a kind of cultural blinkeredness um, that I don't think it undermines the universality of the argument about self-development. Um, Partly, I suspect, because I'm also influenced by kind of ancient Greek ethics and think that that's the appropriate kind of way of going about it. But um, it does raise kind of really important and interesting questions. And I suppose I think they're questions that reading Mill in an ex-colonial context sort of helps you sort of think back and work with uh, your own interpretation of how far his picture of self-development is one that would be recognizable in your context. And if you, insofar as it doesn't sort of fit with you, then I think you could see his assumption of the universality of his argument as flawed. In fact, it's not that much of an assumption. He doesn't necessarily think that everybody will go in this direction. This is the direction that European and Western societies have gone, and in that he's very much part of a 19th century kind of colonial blindness. Sorry, and the second part was
It's two questions later. She has sorry, Mute has added a
all
point
right.
of can religious freedom truly exist in societies where religious identity is tied to
Yeah.
national or political
No, no. I think he thinks no, and I think he's right. Uh, and it is surprising how much of the essay, um, less up front, but in the background, is rumbling away on this concern about religious intolerance. Um, Mill had no religious upbringing. His father just never talked about religion. It was something that he knew about sociologically, but he had no kind of experience of it. And part of his breakdown in his 20s was a sense of there must be more to life than just utility. Uh, but his response was a religion of humanity. If there's going to be uh, some form of transcendence, it's about working for a larger kind of human purpose rather than an extra-worldly kind of purpose.
Professor, I hope we can take 4 more questions just because the interest of participants. We have a question from Kajol. If every opinion, even false ones, have utility that shouldn't be shut down, how will it reach the end goal of self-development of an individual? Its impact on public discourse and thus retardation of its self-development. Asking this in the current context of proliferation of opinions on social media and the internet, where navigating opinions and reaching truth is made harder.
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. I find the opening section on why you should tolerate sort of opinions one of the least persuasive aspects of Mill. I mean, should we be having sort of lectures in geology departments on why the Earth is only 4,000 years old, even though we've established scientifically that it's a lot older than that? I mean, that doesn't quite work. I think that the issue about the multiplication of sources of or multiplication of opinion through social network is a really good point. I think one of the things that we need to be aware of, and that I think would support sort of Mills to some extent, is the worry about social media is not that there's a lot of opinion out there. The worry is that people get stuck in silos. Yes, it's difficult to sort out the wheat from the chaff, but it's not impossible. But it requires a kind of intelligent engagement with material that people need a kind of degree of training for, I think. So I don't think proliferation of opinion is in itself bad. Where it's bad is where the particular silos develop that mean that people end up placing too much faith on too limited a source of information. Yes, it makes truth harder, but I think that's just something we have to suck up.
Thank you. We have a question from Kalyani. Hello, Professor. Isn't Mill being too idealistic when he's advocating for upholding the view of even a dissenting person against the view of everyone else in the society, probably also supported by the state?
Too idealistic in the sense of hoping that it would happen, or too idealistic in the sense of, does one person really matter? Mill clearly thinks that every person really matters, and that it's not idealistic to think that the law should protect people who are acting in ways that we find weird and sort of offensive in various kinds of ways, but which don't cause us any harm. Too idealistic in terms of the state actually doing that. Mill is trying to set out what ought to be. And insofar as we think with him, I think the idea that you can just not worry about single individuals, I think he would reject that, and I think rightly.
The last two questions from Monica was part of the Crush initiative also. Insofar that Mill is taking into account the psychological and social factors in determining one's individuality, I was wondering whether Mill's conception of liberty is one that gives primacy to autonomy. If this is the case, how does Mill's liberal thought differ from Kantian liberalism, which also emphasizes self-determination and flourishing of human reason and rationality? Relatedly, this is in bold, is there no conception of moral good and moral actions in Mill beside the idea of self-development?
So I think it's a very good question. I think autonomy, I think autonomy is important to Mill, though he talks about it largely in terms of self-direction. Um, it doesn't have the, I mean, he's familiar with a lot of German writing, but it doesn't really have the kind of full sense of kind of Germanic rational, self-conscious self-determination. Um, he and it doesn't, partly because he's aware that autonomy is always limited because we are creatures of our society and our place in history. And whereas Kant, I think, does tend to sort of think that somehow there's a kind of noumenal realm that allows us to step out of that. Mill, I think, at his sort of most persuasive, is someone who doesn't think we step out of it, but thinks that we work within it in ways that allow us degrees of freedom and degrees of self-development, insofar as we kind of use our critical faculties to good purpose. Um, I think there is a conception of moral good beside the idea of self-development, in that I don't think utility is just about self-development. But I don't think you can make sense of his conception of utility without thinking about his conception of self-development. So, um, uh, so I think it's a really good question. And if we were here for a couple of days, then we could gnaw away at this one. I think that the best way of approaching it is to say, look, it's we tended to think, he's got an idea of self-development and he's got this idea of harm and he's got this idea of utility, and they're just separate things, but actually they're all integrally connected, which means that his kind of moral doctrine is much more complicated than any one of those single components.
The last question, thank you for your patience, from Sonali Kale. When Mill is defending individuality against social tyranny, his main foil is both the Victorian morality represented aristocratic classes and by the rising middle classes and their opinions. What is Mill exactly referring to when he's talking about the collective morality as developed by the middle classes?
Oh, so it's not clear. There are many targets. In many respects, I think he's um, uh, unhappy with the increasing concern of the middle classes for respectability and respectable behavior. The do-gooding sort of emphasis in the middle classes for helping the working class liberate themselves from alcoholism and poverty and degradation by making them work harder. But another way of responding to the question is Mill falls out with his family because of the way in which they respond to his very odd relationship with Harriet Taylor. And he's basically saying, this is sort of none of their business. And he doesn't meet his own principle in that if people don't include her, which they clearly have a right not to under his kind of view of expressing their own sort of kind of perspective, then he falls out with them. So there's a kind of there's a battle of kind of with a Victorian morality that he himself feels subjected to by both friends and members of his kind of family. It is middle class sort of morality. The aristocracy in many respects have always been immoral, and we don't have to worry about that. But the middle classes are developing a kind of collective ethos that is damaging to, or that is sort of stultifying for people who think differently or think originally, or who just want to live their own lives. It's knowing exactly what's motivating his argument is difficult. There's no doubt what the argument is, but what's fueling it is another question.
I'm afraid we have to put a pause to the question answer session just because of the interest, for the interest of time. We're really sorry, Aditya, Tyagi, and Niyati, Pavitran, and others who may have had more interesting questions. We hope some of this we can also discuss through the closed reading session. But Professor Mark Philp, this has been really great we're really grateful that you've given such a wonderful keynote speech, and also so patiently, with so much of a precision answer to questions which our scholars have asked here. Thank you so much for being part of this collaborative initiative between Jindal University and Cash Initiative. And Cash Initiative is a bunch of young, passionate scholars, and I feel the initiative is quite successful in bringing more passionate scholars to the fold, very truly mirrored in the questions that came up here as well. A, a big thanks to you, Professor, for your time today.
Well, thank you very much for
Sharing
inviting me, and thank you for some very, very good questions. And